What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and honestly, I've been wanting to cover what is arguably the most reviled comic in DC Comics' most recent history. This, ladies and gentlemen, is Convergence. But here's the funny thing. As much as this story was hated when it first came out, honestly, I've kind of grown to like it. And these days, I actually dig the story. So what's Convergence? Well, we'll kind of get through that as we go through the story. But in effect, you can almost view Convergence as Marvel Comics' Secret Wars from 2015 before Secret Wars, which is to say, if you guys remember during Secret Wars, right, you had God Emperor Doom who oversaw Battleworld, but you kind of had walls and barriers where these various, realities, right, they were all kind of separated by these walls, couldn't cross over with each other. Well, imagine that happens here, except the walls are removed, just to see how these different realities interact with each other. And that's what Convergence was. It was like a multiversal battle royale in a lot of ways. Now, I also need to specify this comic came out in like 2014, I think. So technically it brought an end to the New 52, but this is long before DC Rebirth, DC KO, any of the Dark Crisis events, any of that stuff. Right, this is a fairly old story. And so what this does is this opens up in the aftermath of Earth 2, World's End. Now, we have covered a little bit of Earth 2. We don't necessarily need to cover World's End per se, at least to understand this. The only thing you really need to know is that by the time you got to the end of the story arc with issue number 26, what was going on was that Darkseid had made his move on Earth 2. If you guys recall our discussion about that, Earth 2 was initially attacked by Steppenwolf, who was sent by Darkseid. So Batman, Superman, and Wonder Woman were all basically taken out. That basically led to the emergence of what were called the Wonders, so effectively the Justice League of Earth 2, for lack of a better word, but new superheroes who started to emerge. What ended up happening is that during World's End, Darkseid launched a second attack, but right before he was about to seemingly destroy everybody, they were all whisked away. And this is where they ended up, right, on this strange place. And so, of course, you have Thomas Wayne Batman, because keep in mind, in the Earth 2 reality, Thomas Wayne had actually survived the gunshot and was basically laying low while Bruce Wayne was operating as Batman. But when Bruce Wayne died in Earth 2 issue number 1, Thomas Wayne ended up taking the mantle of Batman for himself shortly after, and then basically started playing out the role of a superhero. At least a pretty vengeful and hardcore superhero. You also have Jay Garrick, who's the Flash of Earth 2, Val Zod, who's that reality Superman, Alan Scott is the Green Lantern. He taps into the green, which is one of the things we've talked about before, so it's not the traditional Green Lantern powers of the emotional spectrum, but they're also joined by Dick Grayson. Now, Dick Grayson in the Earth 2 continuity is actually more of a war journalist than anything else, but he was married to Barbara Gordon, and while Barbara Gordon was killed, Dick Grayson is one of the guys who was brought here. And so what's happening in this moment is everybody's trying to understand what's going on, right? The immediate aftermath of what they all thought was effectively death. In fact, Yolanda Montez actually turns out to be alive. She's basically the avatar of the Red in the Earth 2 universe, so she can tap into animal powers, essentially. But they're all just kind of realizing the fact that they're alive. They survived being killed by Darkseid, but they don't know where they are. What's crazier is that in the midst of all of this, a dome starts to come down around all of them. And where they initially try to figure out some way to break it, the reality is they can't. And then a figure appears to them, right? And he asks, "Why are you here without your city?" And they say, "Our city was destroyed, right? We were the only ones left. As far as I can tell, we may not even have a planet anymore." And that's where he says, "No city, that's unacceptable. There are protocols for bringing guests to Telos. It is strange that you arrive without a host city. Could I have miscalculated somehow?" And so where initially there's this kind of a murmuring of like, let's attack this guy, right? This guy's the one that brought us here. Let's attack him, subdue him, and force him to send us back. In reality, it's kind of like, let's actually like hear this guy out and find out where we are first. And that's where they're told, "I've waited until the last moment before oblivion. Too soon would court cosmic disaster, just as my master always said." And so the question's asked by Alan Scott, right? Where is he, this master of yours? We need to talk to him. And they're told, he's away from here, leaving the decisions to me. And so here you are, no city. This is an error. And so they ask the question, right? Why have you brought us here? And he says, to continue the work of my master, Brainiac, according to his purpose and his design, the ultimate machine god. He who will judge. And where Val Zod is dismissive at first, right? You have no power over us. He's actually told by Telos, on the contrary, without me and this place, you would be dead, and yet you are not. You are here, the final piece, the last of all the worlds that were or ever will be collected. Perhaps this is a sign, the signal my master told me would one day come. And that's where he kind of starts to get caught up in himself, right? Yes, it must be, right? The time when all must be put in opposition to determine which will be replanted in the universe of worlds and which will be destroyed. Look upon your rival worlds, my test subjects. And that's where they're shown all these other versions of worlds, different realities that are also being held here. Now, the question you're probably asking yourself at this point is, what's going on? Okay, so the long and short of Convergence, at least with this part of the story, is it goes like this. A lot of you guys are aware of Brainiac, right? The idea that Brainiac basically travels the universe. He takes cities from various worlds, he shrinks them down, puts them in bottles, and basically just collects them, right? Inhabitants, living beings and all, are confined within that city. The most popular one is the bottled city of Kandor. Most of you guys probably know about that, a city that was taken from Krypton. Well, with Convergence, what we end up learning is there's a multiversal version of Brainiac. So instead of bottling cities from worlds, he bottles sections of entire realities. And that's why I say it's realities meeting each other. You guys see how cool the premise for this story is. And so that's when Val-Zod tells Telos, free all those cities, right? Free them now. And Telos just tells him, I shall, to fight one world opposed by another until only one world remains. And that's where Batman realizes this guy's talking about a tournament, right? And Telos just says, one that I predict you will not survive. And so he just says, behold, as I reach out to all that inhabit my world and speak to them as one. And he says, citizens of my world, I have brought this convergence upon you. Now is the time. The hour is near. Judgment is here. Only one city shall survive. Only the strong. Since your arrival, I have been the air that you breathe, the water that you drink. I am the very ground that you walk upon. I am your starless sky. I am this world. I am Telos, and I have tended to your every need. But now, the domes will fall, and champions must rise. Never have the powerful among you been more necessary, for you are about to partake in the greatest tournament of all. Your time has ended. Your worlds are dead. But I have the power to grant one city a future. Some of you came to me at a time of infinite crisis. Others were brought here in the final moments of their 0 hour, whether it was a flashpoint for a time that never was, or of kingdoms that will never come. Everyone here was granted life as a result of my dominion. That changes now. Today, your captivity turns to competition, and one city among many will survive this day. Defenders of each domain will battle the other, and only the greatest of heroes will live. Deny me, your people will be destroyed. Disobey me, your cities will be crushed in my hand. Dare to circumvent these conflicts in any way, and the citizens of every city will pay the price. There is no room to make common cause among you, no quarter to be given. Only one city will survive this day. All other worlds will finally know the dark embrace of oblivion. And of course, as you can tell, one of these realities houses Captain Carrot. Yes, it does. Captain Carrot. I love Captain Carrot. Captain Carrot's a super bunny. And so that's where the heroes look at him, right? And they say, you're crazy if you think that they're ever going to fight each other, right? Like, this cannot be what your master had in mind, Telos. Like, this is total madness. And he just says, no, it is destiny. It is convergence. And witness, because it's begun. And so what we do is we switch over to the first storyline that we're going to cover here, which is Superman. And I'm covering this for a very particular reason. But one of the other things to know here is that as part of Convergence, all the different storylines were split into 2-part stories. Convergence itself was 8 issues long. But this particular story about Superman is a very, very important story for what's happening right now in DC Comics. And those of you guys who know what I mean, please don't spoil it. It's a really, really important story because it bridges a gap that I think a lot of you guys might be a little confused about. So what it does is it picks up in one of the domed cities of Gotham. And you just have Superman running through here, right? Watch your step. You aren't him. you know, and he says, true enough, but if Batman can do this without powers, then I can too. But Lois says he spent years developing his skills. You didn't. Plus, he's pretty obsessed and a pretty screwed up guy. And that's where Superman realizes what's essentially a drug deal going down in Gotham. And Lois tells him, right, you're the opposite. But when Superman jumps into all of this, Lois tells him they're probably armed, so at least keep moving. You have not been invulnerable for almost a year. And whatever you do, Clark, be careful. And he just says, no need to worry, right? With all that I have to live for, I am not about to get reckless. And so when these guys realize that he's here, they immediately start attacking him. But in the midst of all of this is when Telos makes his grand statement to everybody. Right now, we don't get the whole thing. We don't necessarily need it. But when you see him say, citizens of my world, that's when the speech begins. But it's really more of a background thing than anything else. And in fact, Lois even says that, right? Like there's some kind of a citywide broadcast, right? Focus on the task at hand, and then we'll worry about what that broadcast is later on. But of course, Superman, despite not having powers, is pretty capable and able to take all these guys out pretty quickly. But then we also kind of get an explanation of the bigger event that's going on here, right? That Lois says, with Gotham cut off from the rest of the world, drug runners could not get their product into the city. And so that's where Superman finishes the statement and says, so these losers use chemicals they knew little about to synthesize their own drugs. And that's when Lois says, and it ended up killing a lot of different people. And so that's the crazy thing, is because keep in mind, the broadcast concludes right at this moment. And so when these guys open fire with a flamethrower on Superman, Lois Lane starts to freak, right? She's like, oh my God, Clark, you know, are you okay? And he's like, don't worry, Lois, I'm fine. Because the dome has now been removed and all of his powers have been restored to him. Now, if you look at this looks like classic Superman, pre-Flashpoint Superman, the one that we got after Crisis on Infinite Earths. There's a reason for that, and that's why I say this story is incredibly important for what's happening now. Because all these guys, right, these criminals are just like, there's no way that's Superman. Like here in Gotham, like all those superhero types lost their powers. Like how is this guy back? Of course, they open fire on him, the bullets bounce off, all the kind of stuff that you would expect. Now, one of the guys ends up getting their hands on Jimmy Olsen, who had actually been photographing the whole thing. But of course, Superman deals with this guy pretty quickly and he deals with the criminals and the day is essentially saved. But bigger than that is when he goes looking around, right? He's like, Jimmy probably has enough photos for a special edition if he can finally get them into Perry's hands. But as he's kind of looking around, it's also him making his way back home. This is why I say it's important, because when he gets back here, Lois says, it's awesome to see you flying again. And he says, no kidding, Lois, I'd forgotten how mundane stairs and elevators can be. I didn't mind playing the role of normal civilian when it was my choice. But when that's actually forced on you, it kind of sucks, right? Which if you're Superman, I mean, yeah, right? Like being made to live as a regular dude, it feels like a huge step down, right? It would feel very, very rough. But Lois is just kind of like, my Superman has returned. And she says, the dome that kept us here is gone. And more important, we can leave. Our baby will be born in Metropolis. And so while they just take the rest of the evening to kind of relax, they also play back the recording that was sent out by Telos. And that's when they realize what's going on, that they have basically been brought here as part of a tournament. And so what you end up doing is switching over to the Gotham City of the Flashpoint universe. Now, a lot of you guys are probably going to be saying here, well, I thought the Flashpoint universe was gone, Rob. Like, I thought it was destroyed. That's addressed here, right? That's one of the things that's addressed. But what ends up going on is that Thomas Wayne in this reality basically says, prepare yourselves for war. And Cyborg just says, right, we can't leap to that conclusion yet, but Batman tells them, anyone capable of imprisoning us here, powerless, can force whatever they want, Cyborg. And Green Lantern is like, maybe. Now, it is important to understand that in this Flashpoint universe, Green Lantern is not Hal Jordan. It's Abin Sur. He survived the crash on Earth. And in fact, there is a story called Flashpoint Abin Sur Green Lantern, I think is what it's called. But he becomes a White Lantern in that story. It's pretty dope, right? It's really, really cool. But keep in mind, you also have Captain Thunder, right? The Flashpoint universe version of Shazam. And he says, Batman's right. If we want to win, we better strike first. And then you also have the Flashpoint version of Superman. Now, the funny thing about this, and one of the things to keep in mind, for those of you guys who don't know about Flashpoint Superman and Flashpoint Batman, it's pretty dope. So Thomas Wayne was actually the one who had survived along with Martha Wayne, and Bruce Wayne was the one who was killed in Crime Alley. Thomas Wayne ends up going on to become Batman. Martha Wayne goes crazy and she becomes the Joker. Yeah, Batman's mom becomes the Joker. Yes, we've made a video on it, and it's an amazing story. But Flashpoint Superman was very different. When he crash landed, he was taken by the government and kept underground. And that's why Cyborg says, you were sheltered in Project Superman, L. You don't know how lethal this can get. And Captain Thunder says, we do, right? War is familiar to us. And Flashpoint Superman just kind of says, right, I've had plenty of bad experiences. And while he has, he doesn't really know how deadly the world can be. Granted, the Flashpoint universe was a very bad, violent place, right? The Amazons were at war with the Atlanteans and all kinds of crazy stuff. But the bigger point is that as dark as it was, he spent most of it in isolation. So there is a credible statement to be made by Cyborg in saying, you were too sheltered. You don't know how bad this can get. But in the midst of all of this, Batman just says, too late, right? I have a flyer coming in hard and fast from the other Gotham. Assume the worst. It's them or it's us. Take him out. Now, of course, we know this is Superman, and Superman has no intention of destroying these guys. And in fact, he says, it feels good to leave Gotham, right? I always found it to be a dark and dreary city. But he says the Gotham ahead looks like it's worse, far more repugnant than our version of Gotham. In fact, it appears their Bruce Wayne owns a string of casinos. But in the midst of that, Flashpoint Superman goes flying by. He's not even really paying attention to Superman in any meaningful way. All he's saying is, out of my way, right? I've seen her, she's alive, and just keeps screaming alive as he races off into the distance. Now, one of the funny things is Superman says, whoever that was, I didn't see him coming. He's as fast as Wally, and he's headed your way. But before Superman can do anything, Captain Thunder shows up here, right? And that's where Lois is like, Clark, like, what's happening, right? What's going on? And Captain Thunder just says, I have seen firsthand what happens when the enemy strikes first. And so he says, the name is Captain Thunder. Not that you'll live long enough to remember it, because he starts pummeling Superman, right? And he says, Batman was wasting his time worrying about you. You're nothing at all. And so Superman just emerges from the rubble, and it's just like, that would make you less than nothing. And he just says, you have a counterpart on my world, Captain Thunder. He would know enough to listen. Do you? And Batman actually whispers in Thunder's ear and just says, that face, he resembles Subject 1. Is he a Kryptonian? Maybe he's trying to trick us. And so that's where Cyborg and Abin Sur have arrived on the scene, right? And they say, we will do whatever it takes to save our people, mister, even if it includes taking you apart. And Abin Sur says, I have doubts about this Cyborg. For the most part, he's the only one thinking rationally in the midst of all of this. And in fact, Superman says, right, you guys are jumping to conclusions, right? You have to listen to me. No one has to die here today. And at that point, Abin Sur's like, I mean, what if he's on the level, right? I mean, like, I suggest we hear him out. And Cyborg's just kind of like, I mean, it's risky, but if you're willing to do it, Abin Sur, then I'm willing to do it too. Like, can we trust that you're alone here, right? And that no one else is going to attack our city? And Superman just says, you have my word. But the problem is that Jimmy Olsen, in his infinite wisdom, shows up here with a whiz wagon, literally an artillery car, and just starts getting ready to fire on everybody. And at that point, Abin Sur and Cyborg are just like, yep, it looks like you're right, Cyborg. Do what you gotta do, right? Because they think that it's an attack. Right? They think that he's lying. But in the midst of all of that, you pick up with Flashpoint Superman, who arrives to meet Lois Lane. Now, one of the things to keep in mind here is that General Lane in the Flashpoint universe was part of Project Superman. Lois Lane ended up discovering Superman, and the two of them spent some measure of time together. She eventually goes on to join the Resistance, and in fact, I think there's a 3-part comic that focuses on that, but ultimately she dies. But for the most part, Superman was in love with her, right? So that was really his first true experience with actually losing something meaningful to him. That's why when he hears that Lois is alive, he immediately seeks her out. Not only that, right, while he's there, Thomas Wayne Batman is looking at this whole place, right? He's looking at this version of Gotham, and he's like, that's their Gotham. Is it from Barry Allen's world, right? The one where Bruce is alive. I thought that that world, that timeline, would replace ours. If it meant that my son would live again, then so much better. Now, here's what he's talking about here, right? When the original Flashpoint story happened, Barry Allen went back in time, saved his mom's life, and basically rewrote reality. That was the original story. We ended up finding out that Dr. Manhattan was the one who was actually messing everything up. But based on the original storyline, when Barry Allen went back in time and saved his mom's life and rewrote reality, Barry Allen had ultimately realized what was going on. thanks in no small part to Reverse Flash. But one of the things that had happened here is he had informed Thomas Wayne that the reality he comes from is a reality where Bruce Wayne is alive. And so by the time you get to the end of the storyline and Barry Allen figures out a way to go back, realizing he has to let his mom die, Thomas gives him a note to give to Bruce. But the idea was that when Barry went back and undid Flashpoint, it would wipe this universe out. It would cease to exist. What seemingly happened here is that, like so many other realities from Convergence, this one was plucked out right before its destruction and brought here, right? Placed in this area. And so that's why Thomas Wayne is kind of struggling with the idea that maybe his son is alive. Now, Thomas Wayne does not know this is the New Earth DC continuity, not to be confused with the New 52. That's a whole different reality. So he doesn't know that this is not the universe that Barry Allen comes from. He thinks it might be, but he doesn't know for sure. And so that's why he asks him the question, if it is the reality where his son is alive, which there's any number of realities where it's like that, how do I fight them? Right? How do I fight my own son? In the midst of that, Flashpoint Superman busts into the apartment where Lois Lane is at. And then at that point, just kind of starts addressing her almost as somebody that he knows. And he says, like, you must remember me, right? You must know me. And she's like, I know a version of you, but you are not my Superman, right? And so that's when he goes to approach her and she starts calling out for Clark. But he is tied up in the middle of a fight and he cannot respond. Or at least he can't respond in the moment. It's kind of funny how this goes down, right? Because at that point, you jump back over to him facing off with Captain Thunder, Cyborg, and Abin Sur. And he's not really fighting to destroy, right? He's fighting really more defensively than anything else. And where he goes to rescue Jimmy and just like lands the whiz car down on the ground, then he kind of addresses everybody else and says, look, now's your chance, people, right? The only reasonable thing to do is to work together to save both of our cities. But Captain Thunder just says, we cannot take that chance. Like the voice said, one city lives and the other city dies. One of us has to be destroyed. And so at that point, Superman realizes there's no reasoning with these guys, right? There's no getting these guys to stand down and to understand that they're not enemies. And even if they do understand it, the desire to simply stay alive overrides any and all reason that's going on there. So he literally uses his heat vision and just like melts the cannon of Cyborg, right? And it's like, damn, this guy can do everything Subject 1 can, only better. And that's where Thunder's just like, fine by me, right? It means that I can really cut loose and let this guy have it. And where he starts pummeling Superman as hard as he possibly can. What's funny about this is he's not really doing much in the way of damage. Superman's just kind of like blocking his shots and paying attention to what's going off in the distance because he hears Lois Lane calling out. And in that moment, he's like, we're done here. And he races off, right? That's one of the things to know, right? When it comes to Superman and Lois, it doesn't matter what's going on or where she is in the world. He always knows what's happening with her. And he will always immediately leave whatever he's doing in order to make sure she's safe. It's kind of the classic perfect love story in so many ways. So when he says we're done here, he just like clocks Captain Thunder in 3 moves and then just leaves, right? Which really just kind of shows how overpowered he is and how little chance Captain Thunder had in defeating him. Now, where Abin Sur shows up to attack Superman, Jimmy Olsen basically fires a shot that incapacitates Abin Sur and gives Superman the time he needs to get out. The problem is that while that's going on, Superman from Flashpoint shows up in Thomas Wayne's Batcave, right? And it's just like, Lois needs a doctor and I can't risk taking her to a hospital. And so he just asks, right? Like, how did you find this place, L? And Flashpoint Superman is just like, I hear whatever I want. And I see through walls, buildings, masks. And so Batman, in seeing all this, is just like, that's Lois Lane from the other Gotham. And Lois is just like, I promise you this, take me back now and you won't be hurt. But if you keep me here, you will rue the day that you snatch me from that house. But Flashpoint Superman just says, all I care about is keeping her safe and getting her the medical attention that she needs. And so Lois is just like, you have no idea who and what you're messing with. He will come for me. And that's when Batman just asks, why? Like, why do you care about this Lois Lane? But again, he lost the Lois of his universe, right? And he says, everybody else around me wanted to use me, but Lois Lane in our reality, she was nice. She was sweet, right? I really loved her. And Thomas just says, but these people are our enemies, L. And Superman's just like, she's not an enemy, right? She will never be my enemy, and I will not allow any harm to come to her. And so at that point, you switch over to Superman, right? And when he gets back to the apartment where Lois Lane is supposed to be, you end up finding out that Abin Sur's there, right? And he says, I've traveled the galaxies. I know a true enemy when I see one, and you are clearly not an enemy. But Superman's not here to have small talk, right? He's not here to have any huge discussions or anything like that either. He's here to get Lois. And because Lois isn't here, his goal is to find her. And so at that point, Abin Sur just kind of fills him in on who it is that he's dealing with, right? He explains the nature of Flashpoint Superman. He explains the nature of Flashpoint Batman and why it is that they're doing what they're doing, why they're functioning the way that they are. And so it really kind of gives Superman a motivation to not destroy them per se, which I doubt he was ever really going to do in the first place, but it gives him some measure of empathy and something to work with when he's talking to them. And so that's when he realizes that the reason why Flashpoint Superman had taken her to Thomas Wayne is because Thomas Wayne's a doctor, which means Lois is about to go into labor. And that's exactly what happens. Superman shows up here, he deals with Flashpoint Superman pretty quickly, and then at that point, Batman's just like, is there anyone who cannot find this place? And Superman's just like, show him, Lois, right? She actually made it pretty easy, because Lois had her headset in the entire time, which was very easy for Superman to locate given his computer. And so when the two of them start talking to one another, at least Flashpoint Batman and Superman, that's when all the guards start coming down. Because he looks at Thomas Wayne and he says, you're a doctor, right? You can deliver this baby. And Thomas just says, no, right? I have not done anything like that since Bruce died. I don't even know if I know how to do that anymore, right? You can use my equipment. And that's exactly what happens. Superman basically uses the equipment to help Lois give birth to their son. And so once he's born, the two of them holding this baby, Thomas Wayne is looking at it and then looks at them and is like, do you know Bruce? And Superman is just like, very well, right? He's a very good man. And Thomas just says, I held my son as his life slipped away. Life is the most precious commodity there is. Whatever you have to do to protect that child, do it. And Superman is just like, absolutely, 100% I will. And so at that point, they start asking the question, what do we call them, right? What do we name our son? Do we name him Jor after your father? And that's where Superman just says, you know, I think of myself as human. And so Lois just says, Jonathan Kent. We will name him Jonathan Samuel Kent, because this, ladies and gentlemen, is the same Jonathan Kent that exists in the main DC universe right now. Now, how do you square that circle? Right? How do you make that make sense? Okay, so the cool thing about Convergence is there eventually comes a point when Superman and Lois and Jonathan end up in the New 52 reality once it's all said and done. That was in a phenomenal story written by Dan Jurgens. We covered it. It's absolutely incredible. What was happening was that at the time that the New 52 Superman was running around with the Justice League and doing his superhero antics, pre-Flashpoint Superman was operating under the radar. He was staying hidden. Him and his family, they were staying off the radar. And in fact, a lot of the major events, major crises that were being averted on Earth were being averted because of pre-Flashpoint Superman. There were various threats that the Justice League never even had to contend with because pre-Flashpoint Superman dealt with it beforehand. And the reason why was because of all of his experience, because of everything that he had learned over his time as Superman, where the New 52 Superman was very young and very reckless. What ended up happening is that DC wrote a crossover between Superman and Action Comics called Superman Reborn, which basically saw the New 52 Superman merging with the pre-Flashpoint Superman. And that's the version of Superman that we have now. So the version of Lois in the main DC universe right now, that's this version of Lois. Jonathan, the exact same thing. And Superman, more or less the same thing. Superman Reborn was just a way to bring pre-Flashpoint Superman into the New 52 universe. So, with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this video to an end. Hopefully you guys enjoyed it. If you did, drop a like. Thank you all for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.